It's funny how sometimes a single solo that you hear can really change the way that you think about music and what you're trying to learn. In this case, it was a pretty obscure video and a single solo that I kept coming back to, and that has really influenced what I've been practicing for years. And I never even transcribed it. I just realized that I needed to figure out how to get that one thing a lot stronger in my playing. The solo that I'm talking about is this incredibly low resolution Jon Damian solo where he's playing Sweet Georgia Brown in a duo with Jake Langley. Both, of course, amazing guitarists. A part of what made it stand out is probably the contrast between Jon and Jake's solos, where Jake is playing a lot more traditional bop-oriented eighth note lines, and Jon is relying almost purely on sparse melodies and a lot of creative and swinging rhythms. When I first listened to this, then I did not immediately get what it was that I liked so much about the solo, but that's also why I kept coming back to it and tried to figure out why I thought it was great. And gradually I started to realize that this was about playing more interesting rhythms and not focus as much on eighth note lines, which is what I had done until then. I needed to learn to hear phrases with that type of rhythm. Let's first look at what I'm talking about. A great but dense eighth note bebop line could sound something like this. But jazz is also about syncopation and rhythm, and what you also want to be able to do is improvise a line like this. And here you have fewer notes, but there's a lot of energy and tension in the rhythm, and that really brings the whole thing to life. Who said early Jim Hall? So how do you practice this? Now, ironically, the best way to get more options is to limit yourself and use that to develop your skills. Let's start with a simple rhythm, something that you compose yourself, or take something from a solo that you like. Actually, there are some great themes and solos to check out for inspiration, but I'm going to come back to that later in the video. In this example, I'm just using a few notes to keep it flexible. I'm using 2, but 3 could work as well. Just make sure that you don't make a long, complicated phrase like this. And that's because you want something that you can work with and make variations of and eventually even take through an entire song. The first thing I'm trying to do is to move around the rhythm. So displacing rhythms is actually a very important part of jazz phrasing and jazz melodies. If you listen to songs like Bernie's Tune or Broadway, then you can hear how this is really a core part of that song. A few ways that you can work on this is to practice just taking the basic phrase and then move that around. That could be like this, where I'm just shifting the phrase around 1/8 note at a time. Of course, this is a pretty intense and calculated exercise, and you can also just work in a more free way with just composing lines, and in that way getting new rhythms into your vocabulary, like this. Another way to work on this that's quite fun is to take a 1-chord backing track and then just take a short phrase and move that around. Try to move it to different parts of the beat and just hear how that sounds. And in that way, incorporate that into your playing. And of course, you can then gradually take this and move it over to more complicated progressions or even complete songs. There is another way that you can develop more rhythmical playing, which will also lead me to actually give advice that's the opposite of what I usually say. What you can do is explore simple ways to make variations of a rhythm. Now, the example that I started with in this video actually has a fair amount of space. So you can start just adding a few notes here and there, and in that way create some variations. When you have very active rhythms like this, then it's often easier to use very basic melodies, and usually I suggest you should work with arpeggios. But probably it's easier to work with scale melodies here because they're less likely to just sound like abstract skipping around. You can of course also explore removing notes or shortening the phrase instead of adding to it, and in that way take it even further. Anything you want to learn, you also want to learn at least partially by ear. You need to know what it sounds like. I've already mentioned that you should check out themes similar to Bernie's Tune and Broadway. And actually working on bebop themes in general is very useful because even if Parker often plays more dense lines, then these rhythms are certainly in there. And most of his compositions are really great examples to learn from. This is also one of the main reasons why Donna Lee may not be written by Parker, since it's a lot more dense and it's a lot more on the beat. So it doesn't really have as many of those rhythms as you'll find in the rest of his compositions. When it comes to solos, then it makes sense to go a little bit back and find people that are a little bit closer to swing, because there's just more of that type of rhythm. Charlie Christian is a great example. But of course, as I already mentioned, Jim Hall, and especially the early Jim Hall, if you check out his solo on Stomping at the Savoy or Stella by Starlight, then you hear a lot of rhythms and a lot more emphasis on playing other types of material than just bebop lines. As you can probably tell by now, I'm using the same tools for rhythm that I use when I'm working on melodic scales and solos. And another great way to work with melodies is to use call response. So of course we want to take that concept and apply it to rhythm as well. The concept here is that you listen to what you played and then you try to come up with a response to that. In this case, the main statement is relying mostly on offbeats, which creates a lot of tension, and then a logical response will resolve that by using more downbeats. And that's also what you can see in both of the examples that I have here. Of course, these are just examples of what I hear in a response, and you might hear something completely different, which is actually great. Once you start using rhythms like this, then you also want to take this material and these rhythms and apply them to your eighth note lines, which is going to make them sound 10 times as good. And this is also really a part of that language. If you want to check out how to do this and some of the things that you want to be aware of, then check out this video that covers some of the most important things to learn to get solid bebop phrasing.